Hello classes, this is Mr. Holmes. Today we're going to be talking about solving equations with square roots and cube roots. So basically we've talked about equations in the past, how to solve for x, like x plus 2 equals 10. Now we're going to go into more details. What if we have an exponent now with a square or a cube? So just reviewing from our previous video with square roots, cube roots, I'm just going to write out the perfect squares up to 12 and the perfect cubes up to 10, because having this list in handy will be very helpful with solving. So we'll start with our perfect squares. So remember, a perfect square, and I'll just review the definition, a number whose square root is an integer. So 1 is a perfect square because 1 times 1 is 1. 4 is a perfect square because 2 times 2 equals 4. And we'll just go up to 12 with the squaring of the numbers. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is 81, 10 squared is 100, 11 squared is 121, and 12 squared is 144. And you can keep going more and more, up to 20, up to whatever number. But if you know up to 12, you'll be in good shape. Our other ones are perfect cubes. So like a perfect square, a perfect cube, remember, if you recall, is a number whose cube root is an integer. So instead of timesing it by itself, you times it by itself twice. So for example, 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8. So 8 is a perfect cube. So let's just list them up to 10. If you know these, it's going to be very helpful. 1 is a perfect cube because 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. 8 is a perfect cube because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. 3 cubed gives you 27. 4 cubed gives you 64. 5 cubed gives you 125. 6 cubed gives you 216. 7 cubed gives you 343. 8 cubed gives you 512. 9 cubed gives you 729. And 10 cubed equals 1000. So those are our perfect squares and perfect cubes, and they're going to help us because most of the questions you'll see will involve an answer that gives you a non-decimal. There are occasions where you'll get decimals, fractional answers, but you just use your calculator. So perfect squares, perfect cubes. So there's different scenarios. If I take square root of a number versus taking the cube root of a number. And on your calculator, if you remember, when I do square root, it looks like this. It's the radical symbol, and then I put some number underneath. Whereas cube root, again, the radical symbol, but there's a little 3 next to it. And I take the cube root of a number. So if I took like the square root of 4, I'm going to get 2, and so on. But I got to be careful because there are cases. Sometimes you could get a negative number, sometimes a positive number, sometimes both. Sometimes you'll get an answer that doesn't work. So we're going to look at different cases. So let's start with square roots. So if I did this on my calculator, the square root of, say, 16, and let's do that. Remember, I hit 16, I find the square root button right here, and I get 4. However, what if I did this? I took the square root of negative 16. What is that going to give me? So I'll type in 16, hit the negative sign, then I'll type it. I get an error. An error. So this means that it's not possible. I can't do it. Because remember, the square root of a number is what number times itself gives you that. If you remember your rules for multiplying, dividing negative numbers, you need 2 numbers two numbers multiplied together give you a positive number. For example, my rules for multiplying. If I take a positive number times a positive number, I get a positive. A positive times a negative gives me a negative. And two negatives multiplied together give me a negative. So it's saying I need two numbers multiplied together, the same number, to give me negative 16. And if you look at that, there's no way for me to multiply the same number together to give me negative 16. Because if I did negative 4 times negative 4, that's going to give me positive 16. 4 times 4 is positive 16. I would need one negative, one positive to give me a negative. So there's no way to take the square root of a negative number, because when I multiply a number by itself, it's always positive. So I cannot take the square root of a negative number. Can't take the square root of a negative number. It's not possible. The smallest number I can do the square root for is 0. I can do the square root of 0. If I check 0 and then take the square root, it's 0. So I can do 0. I can't do any negatives. I'll type in any negative number. Let's try 268 negative. Square root doesn't work. Cube root, though, is a little different. If I do, for example, the cube root of 125, we know from our perfect cube table, it's going to work out to a nice number. I hit second 0, remember, does the cube root. That gives me 5. What if I wanted to do the cube root of negative 125? Let's type that. Will it give me an error, or will it give me a number? Let's see, 125 negative, second 0, negative 5. So this actually does give me a answer. So I can take the cube root of a negative number, because with our rules, since I'm multiplying it by itself, remember, a negative times a negative times a negative gives me a negative answer. 3 negatives multiplied together gives me a negative. So it is possible to give me a negative for a cubed root, whereas 2 negatives equal a positive, so I can never do it. So any odd root for solving, you can have a negative. But any even root, like 2 or 4 or 6 or 8, I can't do a negative. And then the last thing you have to worry about with roots is a negative outside the root. So you could see something like this. Let's say I had 100. But let's say I had this on the outside. If I see a plus or minus outside the square root, what I do is first I take the square root of 100, that's 10, and then I take this and place it at the beginning. That's plus or minus 10. If it's before it, it's saying once I take the square root of 100, I want the positive and negative answer. So in this case, it would be just 10 or negative 10. So if you see it outside the square root, a plus or minus, I just take the square root normally, and then I can add it at the end. Even though there's no square root of negative 100, I can still get a negative answer, because I first take the square root of 100 and then I add the positive and negative answers to it. So there's a case you could see too. So now we're going to get into the actual solving of the equations using this idea. So continuing. Let's say I had x squared equals 9, and I wanted to solve for x. Again, our goal is to get x by itself. In this case, x is isolated. We just have to do one final step to solve. Okay, when you solve and there's a root with your number, you have to get rid of the exponent. You get rid of the exponent when you solve. To get rid of the exponent, you do the inverse operation. So x squared and the square root go together. And when you have cubes, x cubed and the cubed root of x go together to undo it. So I want to solve x squared equals 9. So to do this, I just take the square root of 9. And to do this, I just do it like so. I'm just going to do it underneath here. I take the square root of both sides. Because think like when it was something like 3x equals 9, to get rid of the 3, I'd use division. Multiplication, division go together. Addition and subtraction go together. So this is a third scenario of inverse operations. Square root and square go together. Cubed root and cube go together. So when you see an exponent of 2, to get rid of it, you take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of 9, I get 3. I can also get a negative answer too for it, because what number times itself is 9? 3 times 3 is 9, also negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. So I get two answers when I solve an equation. Even though if I just did on my calculator the square root of 9, since it's x squared equals 9, I'm figuring out what number times itself equals 9. 3 times 3 is 9. Negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. So really when I take the square root, it's plus or minus. And we'll do a couple more like that. Let's look at one that looks like this. X squared equals, let's do a fraction now. Let's do 4 over 121. So it's not always going to be a whole number. Sometimes you could have fractions, sometimes you could have decimals. Same concept applies. So our goal is we isolate the x. In this case, it already is. And then to get rid of the exponent of 2, we do the inverse. The inverse of x squared is the square root of x. So what I do is I take the square root of each side. And when you take the square root of each side, it becomes plus or minus, because with squaring, I can have a negative number that works as well as a positive. So I just do this on my calculator. So I type in 4 over 121, and then I hit the square root button. And I get 0.1818. I don't want decimal for these because this one's ugly to write. So I'm going to see if I can write it as a fraction form. And if I do it, it's 2 over 11. 2 over 11. And if you just look right here, what number times itself is 4? That's 2. What number times itself is 121? That's 11. And remember, since it's squared, a negative number squared equals a positive, and a positive number squared also equals a positive. So it has two answers. So really it's 2 over 11 and negative 2 over 11. So whenever you solve an equation with x squared, it will have two answers, a positive one and a negative one. That's only when it's x squared. So it could be positive or negative. Let's look at some ones that deal with cube now. So let's start with x cubed equals 64. To solve an equation with x cubed, I do the inverse of the cubed, which is the cubed root. Cubed root and cube go together. So to solve this, I take the cubed root of both sides. And when I take the cubed root of x cubed, that just becomes x. And then I just do the cubed root of 64. Second 0, 64, negative, second 0 gives me negative 4. So that's my answer. Oh, sorry, it's just 64, my bad. 4. I'm thinking it's negative 64. It's 4. This one has just one answer when you deal with a cubed. Because if I thought it was negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4 gives me a negative answer. With cubed or any odd root, there's only one answer, okay? So with a cubed root, there's only one answer. Only one answer, so it's x equals 4. Let's look at another question. Let's do x cubed equals negative 27. So I take the cubed root of each side. And on my calculator, if I do 27 negative and take the cubed root, second 0, I get negative 3. And that would be my answer. Negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 is negative 27. No positive answer, just strictly negative. Whenever I solve an x cubed equation, I will always have an answer. There's only going to be one answer, but it could be positive, it could be negative. I'll always have an answer for x cubed. However, with x squared, I'm going to have two answers, but there will be scenarios where I will get no answer. So let's look at another one. Let's say I had x squared equals negative 81. To solve this, I would take the square root of each side. However, if I do on my calculator 81 negative and take the square root, I can't do because there's no number times itself that gives me a negative. Remember, 2 negatives equal a positive, 2 positives equal a positive. So this is no solution. So I can't. So whenever I have something with x squared equals a negative number, my answer will not be possible. It will be no solution. Though I can have an x cubed equals a negative number, I can't have an x squared. So know the difference. When I have an x cubed, I can get a negative answer. When I have an x squared equals a negative, no answer. Anytime x squared equals a positive number, I'm going to have two answers. Positive root, your negative root. And an exponent of x cubed will only give me one answer. So those are the scenarios. So we're just going to look at one or two more now that involve just an extra step. So let's look at this. 7x squared equals 49. So now instead of just a one-step equation, this becomes a two-step equation. Okay, so the first step I need to do is I'm going to get rid of the 7. So to get rid of the 7, I'm going to divide by 7. So this gives me x squared equals 7. Though 7's not a perfect square, I can still get it, an answer. So the final step is I'm going to take the square root of each side, and I just do this on my calculator. So I get 7 square root, and I get 2.64575. So I'm going to write it out to 3 spots after the decimal. And if I wanted to round it to the nearest hundredth, that's 2 spots after the decimal. After the 4 is a 5, so that means I round up. It would give me 2.65 to the nearest hundredth. So yes, you can get answers that are not really nice numbers that go on for a while. Just round it to whatever they say. It could be hundredth, thousandths, tenth, whole number. That's how you go about it. And we'll look at one with a cubed. So we'll do 5x cubed minus 55 equals negative 140. So I want to solve for x. So notice there's an exponent with the x. So when you solve with an exponent, you do all your other steps normally, and then your last step is to get rid of the exponent. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 55 to each side. Negative 140 plus 55. If I do that, that gives me negative 85. Then I'm left with 5x cubed equals negative 85. And then I divide by 5. X cubed equals negative 17. And then my final step is to solve for x. Since it's an exponent of 3 to solve, I take the cubed root of each side. And I just do that on my calculator. 17 negative, the cubed root, second 0, gives me negative 2.571, which will round to negative 2.57. And that would be my answer. That's the only answer that would work. No positive number, because 3 negatives equal a negative. 3 positives equal a positive. And we'll look at one more. Let's do the following. Let's do x squared divided by 8 plus 20 equals negative 200. So the first thing I do is I'm going to solve for x. I'm going to minus 20 from each side. That gives me negative 220, x squared over 8. To get rid of the 8, since it's x squared divided by 8, the inverse of dividing by 8 is multiplying by 8. So I'm going to multiply each side by 8. Negative 220 times 8. So negative 220 times 8 is negative 1760. Now I need to solve for x. So it's saying, what number times itself is negative 1760? So to solve this, I take the square root of each side. And if I do that on my calculator, the square root of negative 1760 gives me an error. So that means no solution. There's no number I can take when I multiply it by myself is negative 1760. So this equation would have no answer. So it's not possible for any number to work that solves this. Because just think, if I square a number here, this is going to be positive, and then when I add 20, it's going to be a bigger positive. There's no way to get a negative number ever when I do this. So this concludes the video on how to solve equations with square roots and cube roots. Know your perfect squares, know your perfect cubes, and when you have an equation to solve for one with x squared, you do the inverse, which is taking the square root. When you have a x cubed, you solve by taking the cubed root. And remember, you can't take the square root of a negative number. You can take the cubed root of a negative number. This is Mr. Holmes' video, and this concludes it. Have a good rest of the day, and take care. Bye-bye.